Check, check, check. There we are. Yes. Hey. On. Just started the stream. Live. And push out. Okay. Bye. Oh, you good.
Very cool. So AJ, can you hear me when I'm speaking? Very good. And good that you love history. Me too. Well, 5 o'clock. And it looks like we're the only ones here so far. So AJ, what area of history do you like the most? As for lectures, tonight we will do live streaming. We'll probably continue that for the rest of them. That way I can give you a little more in-depth information than what you'll get in the book. Great-great-granddaughter of Longstreet. That's pretty cool. What degree are you looking to finish up? Well, I have my master's in history, and it's done me pretty well. Yeah, you still got time to figure it out. It's not a waste of time, and there's 15 in the class. Just means that you'll get the information before they will. Do you have the book? Okay, good. Have you gone over the syllabus? And I see someone else has jumped in, so go ahead and say that you're here and who you are. Yes, there's another person here, so we just need them to sound off. Oh, and then they went away. Didn't confuse you. You got here just fine. All right, well, we're 10 minutes in, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Just trying to pull up some stuff here. All right. So taking a look at the syllabus here. This week we are going to be focusing on the Civil War, the causes, the effects, and Reconstruction. So by the end of this session, we are going to evaluate the cause and impact of the Civil War, discuss why Reconstruction was important to the formation of the modern United States, and the analyzation of the impact of President Lincoln on the Civil War and Reconstruction. So taking a look at the reading and viewing assignments, you're supposed to read pages 399 through 402, then 424 through 507. Also read Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, Technology and Casualties of the Civil War, and the 10 facts about the Emancipation Proclamation. If you haven't clicked on them already, you can see that they come up with an article there. And the biblical perspective. guys can read through that. And you can see the assignment folder. The first thing on the discussion board is getting to know you. So basically, we'll go to that. So I guess I didn't post my biography yet, but I sort of did. So go ahead. I want you guys to post that. And then on the discussion board, you can see here, you make a response. Then also you make sure that you respond to other people's responses. That's the discussion board. Then we have 3 questions. You'll be assigned 1 question to respond to initially, then we'll discuss. And then discussion will open up on this one. So please explain how at least 2 topics following the Civil War or following topics influenced the outbreak of the Civil War: Dred Scott decision in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the rise in price of slaves, and the fall of the price of cotton, Minnesota and Oregon becoming states, the role of tariffs and taxes on the North and South, the economies of the North and South, and the lacking of the South in the financial system. Then number 2, reviewing the reading of the week and the article, Technologies and Casualties of the War or the Civil War. Please explain in your own words why there were so many casualties in the Civil War. Question 3, after reading Lincoln's second inaugural address and the biblical perspective for this session, detail why you believe this speech was so important at the time it was delivered. What are the elements of the biblical worldview that are evident to you? Do you see any current application to the values and beliefs that Lincoln espouses? And then we have our comprehensive quiz. 10 questions. You'll have 30 minutes to take those. So you want to take those once you feel ready for it. Going back up here, you have until Sunday at midnight. That's Mountain Time to go ahead and do that. So okay. So let's see. AJ, do we respond to 2 per the 3 questions? Yes, that is correct. See, we have 3 people again. Who is the 3rd person? If you can hear me, go ahead and sound off and introduce yourself to the rest of the class. You can see you're on there, so just waiting to see you when you decide to step up and say hello. We're going to start going into the first part of this discussion is some of the causes and heading towards what caused the Civil War. So AJ, you're familiar with the Civil War. How familiar are you? Or when was the last time you, I guess, studied the Civil War? Justin, welcome along. Welcome aboard. Well, since it's been a long time for some of us, what we're going to do is we're going to go over kind of the pre-Civil War stuff. We're going to go over the Civil War itself. Then we'll get into Reconstruction. Because since it's been a while since you guys have had some classes about the Civil War, we're just going to go more in depth into it since we have the time. That'll help you out when you're doing your assignments. Sound good? Like I said, we got 3 on here, so we're going to go ahead and delve into this. All right, hold on a second. We're all having technical issues now. Trying to open up our first part of our lecture. Just give me a second. Okay. All right, so you can see all that. So you should be seeing the PowerPoint presentation here. Can you guys still hear me? Okay. All right. Well, we're having some difficulties with the PowerPoint coming up. Now it disappeared again. Interesting. Give me a minute. Sorry, everyone. All right, hopefully we're going to see the PowerPoint. Yep, there it is. Okay, so technology. All right, so yes, technology is wonderful. All right, so winning of the Second War of Independence. So basically, after the War of 1812, War of 1812. Who knows what the War of 1812 was about? Go ahead and chime in if you know what it was about. Anyone know what the War of 1812 was about? Can you all still hear me? Can you all still hear me? That was part of it, AJ. Justin, do you know anything about the War of 1812? Let me know if you can still hear me. I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Hopefully. Okay. The screen's kind of blurry, so I'm just going to go over what it says. Hopefully it'll clear up. Otherwise, we may just be talking and no PowerPoints, and I'll put those up later so you can check them out. All right, so War of 1812 lasted from 1812 to 1815. It actually ended after the peace treaty was signed. There was a peace treaty signed in Ghent on December 24th, 1814. The final battle of the War of 1812 was in January of 1815, the Battle of New Orleans. So the war was basically about the British were. It was about trade. It was also about it was about the British were fighting Napoleon, and they needed sailors, so they went ahead and what they basically said, I'm going to stop this because it's coming up blurry for you guys. So I'm just going to stop with the PowerPoint and just give you the lecture. So I hope that's okay. Here. Of course, now we're jammed. All right, so let's do this live. Oh, there I am. All right, so sorry, stumbling along here. Like we said, technology is a wonderful thing. So the War of 1812 ends in 1815 with a treaty again, and after the British are defeated at the Battle of New Orleans. Some people call this the Second War of Independence. But what the war did is it actually changed the way things were about the American people. For a long time, they just considered themselves states. They were members of a state. So instead of being, after the War of 1812, instead of being a New Yorker, you saw yourself as an American finally. Also, during this time is when confidence started to rise in the federal government. So also after the War of 1812 is when you had lots of economic and an economic boom and expansion. There were internal improvements. They started building new roads and canals to move farmers' crops from the western farms in the west was considered Indiana and Ohio to the eastern markets in New York, Philadelphia, and that's where you had the Erie Canal built. Also, new roads and canals allowed eastern manufacturers to ship their stuff westward. So this helped expand westward expansion. And when we talk about western expansion, we're talking about into, like we said, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, west in the south as well. Roads and canals accelerated the development of western cities, especially along the Ohio Valley. So they were using the Ohio River basically as a highway. And that was getting stuff up and down the river. So things are traveling pretty well across the rivers. Things are going, that's helping to expand the country. So are we all good so far? Let me know if I'm going too fast. Let me know if I'm going too fast. Yes, I'm going too fast. What I'm going to do with these lectures, what I'm going to do with the lectures is I'll record them and post them so you guys can have access to them. But we'll go ahead and continue. So it was after the War of 1812 when about 1823 when John, when it was John Monroe, James Monroe, was president, and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, came up with was saying to the world after, because basically the British were trying to take back the colonies. So what they were saying was Washington, the capital, issued the proclamation warning American citizens to avoid involvement in hostilities, strictly the European war, because that was what was going on with the War of 1812, was the war with Napoleon that the British were in. So John Quincy Adams comes up with the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine basically says all European powers stay out of the New World, and that basically the New World was closed to further colonization. The next part of the Monroe Doctrine was that in return, the United States would not interfere with the European affairs and recognize all existing European colonies in the New World. So basically, if they already had colonies in the New World, that's fine. It's just do not establish any new colonies in the New World. Also, the Monroe Doctrine pledged support for growth of democracy throughout the Western Hemisphere. So that is the Monroe Doctrine, something that has been invoked a couple times. Actually, as we continue towards the Cold War, someone will be invoking, a future president will be invoking the Monroe Doctrine. So during this time, the 1820s, 1830s is when the U.S. really starts to expand. James Monroe, with the Monroe Doctrine, cements foreign policy. In the Treaty of 1818, the border with Canada is set from Minnesota all along the Rocky Mountains along the 49th parallel. This also allowed for the joint occupation of the Oregon Territory, which was at that time Oregon, Idaho, Washington, British Columbia, and part of Montana, with the British until 1828. You also have the Russo-American Treaty of 1824. How many of you knew that the Russians had got all the way down to California? And that's a question you can answer. Just type in if you knew that. Anyone? Little fun fact that the Russians actually had established a colony in the United States or in North America. Yep, they made it all the way to California. If you've ever heard of the Russian River in California, that's why it's called the Russian River. Also, during this time is when General Andrew Jackson seizes Spanish Florida. So basically, he uses we're going to go fight the Seminoles because the Spanish aren't keeping them from crossing our border, so we're going to go fight them and take care of it, and basically takes over Spanish Florida, and Spain cedes Florida to the United States, and in return, the United States agrees to retract its claims on Texas. All right, so let's see who else has joined us. Looks like we have a fourth person who's joined us. Whoever has joined us, welcome aboard. Go ahead and sound off and let me know what your name is and who you are. And also let me know if I'm going too fast or not. So I'm going to give you a little minute here. So I'm going to give you this question, and you guys sound off and let me know what you know that what this is. What is manifest destiny? Anyone know what manifest destiny is? No? Okay. So manifest destiny is the concept that heavily influenced American policy in the 1800s. It was the driving force behind the rapid expansion of the United States into the West from the East, and was promoted through newspapers, posters, and other media during that time. Manifest destiny was not an official government policy, but it did lead to such legislation as the Homestead Act. Yes, AJ, that is correct. It was our destiny to settle the West. So the Homestead Act encouraged westwards the colonization of territorial acquisitions. It also played an important role in American thought. The term manifest destiny was actually used first in 1845 by a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan, who was writing about the proposed annexation of Texas. So Texas, in 1821, Spain basically loses control of Mexico. Mexico becomes its own country. Also during that time, that's when American citizens are immigrating to Texas, and basically sort of Mexico's own manifest destiny. So they're inviting Americans in to settle this land because they didn't have enough people to settle the land. So, but kind of in this weird way that parallels what's going on now, the Americans did not want to acclimate or become part of the Mexican states. So they wanted to stay American but be within inside Mexico. So they declared themselves independent, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But they declared themselves independent and fought a small war with the Mexicans, then won and declared themselves an independent nation. But by 1845, their government wasn't doing so hot, not making a lot of money, so they decided they would rather join the United States since they were mostly already part of the United States. So anyway, back to 1845, John O'Sullivan, an American newspaper editor, was writing about manifest destiny. O'Sullivan stated that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent. The editorial suggested that through expansion, the United States would become a regional recognized social and superpower. America had, in fact, O'Sullivan argued, been chosen uniquely for this task, expanding westwards, driving out the wilderness, and establishing civilization. Westward expansion in the United States did not, of course, begin with manifest destiny. Does anyone know when westward expansion really started? Some purchase that Jefferson made. If you know, go ahead and type it out for me. Anyone know? That's right, AJ, Louisiana Purchase. So westward expansion, yep, good job, Justin. So yes, Manifest Destiny didn't start with just O'Sullivan in 1845, but the Louisiana Purchase, which basically expanded the United States a great deal. In fact, 23% of the existing territory of the United States was acquired in that purchase. The government saw the appeal of acquiring more land as well as the political power which large tracts of land could confer upon our nation. As a result, we expanded actively and aggressively. The idea of manifest destiny was just one part of the component of expansion. Manifest destiny was a catchy phrase. There were a lot of government campaigns that basically helped to make the West look very, very nice to prospective settlers, promoting programs where people could acquire and hold land in the West. Does anyone know what happened in 1849 in California? Go ahead and type it if you know. The gold rush. Exactly. 1849, gold is discovered in Sutter's Mill, California. What is interesting about that is we also fought the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848. Right after they signed the treaty that ended the Mexican War, a couple weeks later is when they found gold in California. So if the Mexican government could have held on a little bit longer, there's a possibility they would have found the gold. It would have changed everything. But they didn't. So you never know. Things could have changed very easily while we were a young nation. So they discover gold, but they also discover other valuable minerals. So all of a sudden, everyone starts moving east. This is the gold rush. This is why California is the third largest economy in the world, not just our nation. Manifest Destiny also is behind American political action overseas. Although the term ceases in the 20th century, there's far-reaching impact of Manifest Destiny. A section of Manifest Destiny editorial reminds Americans that we were uniquely positioned to spread democracy throughout the world, and this concept plays a role in American foreign policy in the 20th century, but we'll get to that. Many historians use the term manifest destiny to refer to a period of American history that was marked with rapid expansion from sea to shining sea and basically annexed the western half of our continent. So like I was saying earlier, the Mexican War of 1848 or 1846 to 1848 is part of manifest destiny. It basically moved away from Washington's proclamation of neutrality. Basically, we're not going to start wars with people. This was manifest destiny, conquer the continent. The war ends with the Treaty of Hidalgo or Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty basically gives the United States a large chunk of territory: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. And the United States just had to pay $5 million for it. Not a bad deal. It was only $10 million for the Louisiana Purchase. The Mexican War also was a training ground for generals that would be fighting each other in the Civil War. You have, that is a good deal. You have West Point graduates like Ulysses Grant, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee all fighting for the United States during this time in the Mexican War. President Zachary Taylor was a general in the Mexican War. He ordered one of his under officers, William Tecumseh Sherman, to explore the new territory. When Sherman returned and reported to the president, he believed that the land was so useless that the United States should go back to war with Mexico to return it. So Sherman wasn't real enamored with Mexico. So how are we doing? Still keeping up, not going too fast? Just let me know. Okay. Justin, you all right? Doing well? Keeping up? So just let me know if you have any questions. So after the Mexican War, doing well. Actually, I'm going to grab something to drink real quick because I'm thirsty. All right, sorry about that. Talking gets the old throat dry. So, okay. All right, so we win the Mexican War. Things are going well. Gold's discovering in California. We're doing great. This is where we start getting into a problem called sectionalism. Now, sectionalism, this is what's going on. And hello, Raul. Welcome aboard. Sectionalism is hitting the United States in the 1850s. At this time, there were 23 million people living in the 31 states of the United States. The eastern part has the industry, which is textiles, lumber, clothing, machinery, leather, and woolen goods. The Midwest and the South are agricultural. So the South's economy is based on agriculture, growing tobacco and cotton. The Midwest starts to provide goods for the rest of the country. So part of the stuff that they're growing is food, that kind of stuff. The Midwest during this time is more considered like Iowa and Minnesota and Missouri and Arkansas, where manifest destiny, as we get bigger, the Midwest is considered Kansas and Ohio, or Kansas and Colorado, those places. Like we said, 1849, gold is discovered in California, adding a ton of money to the coffers of the United States. So one of the things that happens during this time is we're starting to see the sectionalism where things are starting to change, and we're starting to see clashes between regions, sections of the country. So in 1819, Missouri applies for admission to the Union as a slave state. Now, even though that Missouri met all the qualifications, the northern dominated House, so the North is considered, Minnesota, Michigan, all Pennsylvania, New York, those states are considered northern states. They deny the statehood because it would shift the balance of power to the slave states. So at that time, it would have been 11 free states and 12 slave states. So they passed what they called the Talmadge Amendment, that no new slaves could be taken into Missouri, and that the slaves that were already there would be gradually freed. This is what is known as the Missouri Compromise. So Southerners are outraged by the Northerners trying to eliminate slavery, and they block the Talmadge Amendment in the Senate. So what happened is that Henry Clay in the Senate proposes the Missouri Compromise. Basically, if we're going to admit Missouri as a slave state, you have to admit a free state. So in exchange for Missouri being a slave state, the Southerners agreed they would admit Maine as a free state, keeping that balance. This is also where you get the line that cut off where slavery can go. So the compromise also declared that slavery was illegal north of the 3630 parallel west of Missouri. So basically, the bottom of Missouri up, no more slaves, no more slave states. So this also is a problem with sectionalism. You have the South resenting the North because they're making large profits off of what the South is farming, which is cotton and tobacco. Also, the South did not feel responsible for slavery since it had been a way of life for 200 years. How many of you know that basically most of the founding fathers were slave owners? And if you did, chime in. Yep. Founding fathers that came up with the all men are created equal, except for some. But it's also a different time. You can't take 21st century ideas and place them on 18th century thinking. So back to this, slavery. So the South was resenting the North because they were making profits off of everything the South did with their cotton crop. We said by 1850, the South is like, I don't understand why you guys are getting all mad about it. It's been around for 200 years. So slave statistics in the 1860s is that a minority of whites held slaves. Not all slaves were black. There were some Indian slaves. There were some Indians that held slaves. I used to live in Georgia, and one of the more famous Cherokee leaders was a slaveholder. So in 1860, a minority of the whites held slaves. 46,274 planters owned at least 20 slaves, and more than half of the slaves worked on plantations. You also have the poor Southern whites who didn't own slaves, who were basically, you could even say, indentured servants to some of these bigger plantation holders. So one of the big questions was, should slavery expand? After the Mexican War, the United States gained a ton of territory in the West. In 1849, California discovered gold. So the question became, should slavery be extended into the new territories? The answer was, and probably maybe not, maybe so. So you have the Compromise of 1850, strict enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act required the return of runaway slaves. California was admitted as a free state. And remember, we have that line, the 3630 parallel, that cut off where slavery could go. So it couldn't go north of that. But these new territories in the Southwest, so you're talking what would now be New Mexico and Arizona were given the right to choose if they were going to be a slave state or a free state. So that's the Compromise of 1850. You also have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which gave people the right whether the new territories would be free or slave, even though that the land located north of even though most of this land was north of the Missouri Compromise. So Kansas north of 3630, Nebraska above Kansas above 3630. This is where you get Bloody Kansas. And Bloody Kansas is basically that in Kansas, you have this battle over slavery. You have free staters who didn't want slavery in Kansas, but also didn't want blacks in Kansas. Then you have the pro-slavery group who did want Kansas to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. A lot of these guys came over from Missouri, trying to force slavery on Kansas. Then you have the abolitionists. The abolitionists want to get rid of slavery altogether because it's an abomination. No one should be doing it. It's, in the Bible, it's against the Bible to, hold a man slave. Then you have blacks who are going to Kansas because Kansas is a free state. So this was a big, big problem in Kansas. A lot of fighting went on. A lot of people died. And that's why it's called Bloody Kansas. This is where John Brown came and was trying to help the blacks become, free and help Kansas stay a free state. So there's a big thing that went before the United States Supreme Court that really helped set the tone for what's going to happen a little bit later with the Civil War. This goes in front of the United States Supreme Court. It is Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave who was brought to free territory, then he returned to slave territory with his master. So he was brought to free territory. He said, well, that means that I'm free. The Supreme Court found in favor of the slave owner. So you might want to remember this name. Chief Justice Robert Taney declared that Scott was not a citizen but property, interpreting the Constitution, 3/5 of a man, that's what a slave was. So with this decision, it is the North knows that basically with the Supreme Court saying slavery is legal, that there would be no way that the slave question could be basically solved through legal means. So in 1859, a man named John Brown. Who knows who John Brown is? Anybody? Chime in if you know him.
Right now they have at the PetSmart for Petco. The October sale has the palm.
Anyone know who John Brown is? Let me know. So I want to make sure you guys are all still there. Okay. Justin, you don't know? Which is fine. So John Brown is a staunch abolitionist. He really wants to help the blacks. He's very, like I said, a staunch abolitionist. He wants to free the blacks, free the slaves. So one of his great ideas was in 1859, he attempts to raid the military depot at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Basically, what he wants to do is get weapons and arm the slaves and start a slave revolt. It didn't go so well. Basically, John Brown is captured by a colonel named Robert E. Lee. Does anyone know who that is? Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, going to be a Confederate general, lead the Confederacy. And then we also, so he gets captured by Robert E. Lee and is basically taken out and said, you know, you are committing treason against the United States, found guilty, and is hung for treason against the United States and conspiracy. Ironically, one of the people who is at the hanging of John Brown is future Lincoln assassin John Wilkes Booth. Basically, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry helps lead towards the war. So that concludes okay, go ahead, Raul. Sorry, I'll move around. I'm not moving around. So basically that is going to lead us to the Civil War. So I'm going to say it is 6:06. I'm going to give you guys a quick 5-minute break. So go get you something to drink, stuff like that, so you can just take a quick break. And Raul can get his computer working again, and we will be back in 5 minutes. So that is 6:11. So I will see you shortly. Okay? Yes, AJ, I was muted. Now I'm back. So we'll get started here in a little bit. Let's see where we're at. Still have 3. We had 4. We have 3 now. Okay. Okay, so we got about a minute till we start. Whoops, sorry. Notes are getting in the way. Everyone can hear me again, is that correct? Let me know if you can hear me. Type yes if you can hear me. Thank you, AJ. Justin, Raul, can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to assume you guys can hear me. I'm going to go ahead and start up again. We got a lot to cover. So, once again, if I get going too fast, let me know. Okay. Let's quickly check and see. Make sure I'm on. Check, check. Hello, hello, hello. Okay. All right. So the election of 1860 comes along. It is Lincoln versus Douglas. Basically, this is where we are to the point where the Union in the South are to a point where we don't know if it's going to make it. The South basically threatens, if you elect Lincoln, we're out of here. So Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. In December 20th, 1860, after Lincoln is elected, South Carolina secedes from the Union. February of 1861, South Carolina has seceded. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also secede from the Union. These 7 states basically come up with their own constitution, similar to the United States, but stressing self-government for each state. It is during this transition from President Buchanan to President Lincoln that the Confederate States of America demand that the Union surrender forts inside this new nation of the Confederate States of America. Buchanan refuses, so the Confederacy takes them. A ship attempting to resupply Fort Sumter, who is in the within the Charleston area in South Carolina, is turned back by South Carolinian troops. So we are now 2 nations, but Lincoln has basically always said that you can't break the Union. The Union, you just can't break it. There's nothing in the Constitution that states that the Union can be broken, but then you have the Confederacy saying that if, basically going back to Jefferson saying, if this government isn't working for you, you have the right to leave. So, taking a look at the difference between the North and the South. So what do you think the strengths of the North are and the strengths of the South are? You guys go ahead and tell me. What are the strengths of the North and the strengths of the South? Type them in there. Yes, good, Justin. One of the strengths of the South is they were fighting a defensive war, or when the war started, they'd be fighting a defensive war because they knew their territory. Good. Anyone else? True. There weren't any in a lot of the more northern territories. There weren't slaves, but we're going to talk about that. So, agree with Justin? Okay, good. Thank you, AJ. So, total population of the North is 22 million people. Bank deposits for the northern banks are $189 million. They had 20,000 miles of railroad and over 100,000 factories. The South's total population is 9 million. That includes 3.5 million slaves. Their bank deposits are only $47 million. They only have 9,000 miles of railroad. They have 20,000 factories. Ugh. So Lincoln is inaugurated in March 4th, 1861. Lincoln alerts South Carolina that he's going to send supplies to Fort Sumter, hoping that this will, by warning them, he wants to basically prevent a conflict. So he's telling him, okay, I'm going to send a ship. Please don't shell it. Don't shoot it. I'm just resupplying the fort. Of course, what did the Confederacy want? They wanted that fort to be theirs. That basically was just a piece of the Union sitting right inside the Confederacy. South Carolina feared it was going to be a trick, so they asked for the surrender of the fort. The commander of the fort said, I will surrender once my supplies run out. Basically, South Carolina then says, no, we're going to go ahead and take the fort now. So the Confederacy opens fire on Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861, basically starting the Civil War. Now, this is something that is, I don't know if it's well known or not, but during Lincoln's first inauguration speech in March 1861, Lincoln states in his inaugural address that he has no plans to end slavery in states where it has already existed. But he also said he would not accept secession. Once again, it's not in the Constitution that you can secede. But he never said that he was going to end slavery in those states. So with the attack on Fort Sumter, 4 more states joined the Confederacy. After the first Battle of Bull Run, which we're going to get to here in a second, the western part of Virginia chooses not to secede like Virginia did, so they secede from Virginia and become West Virginia. Now, earlier we were talking, or Justin brought up the point, the North has strength of not having to deal with rebellious slaves, but they did have to deal with slaves because on the border, there were states that decided not to secede, but they were slave states. Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri were slave states, but they stayed in the Union. So the first major land battle of the Civil War is the Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, that took place on July 21st, 1861. Now, this battle, this is where you get this weird thing about, I mean, it's hard to explain, but people, when the first battle of the Civil War took place, Bull Run's in Manassas outside of Washington, D.C. People from Washington, D.C. got in their carriages and brought picnics to watch this battle. Can you imagine doing that now? This was just going to be, oh, yeah, it's this nice little thing. It's a show where people die. So the Confederacy and the Union meet at the Battle of Bull Run. It is a huge loss for the Union. Basically, this is a point where the South very easily could have taken Washington, because basically when they defeat the Union at the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, Battle of Manassas, they could have taken Washington, but they didn't. So like we see here, this is basically the Union withdraws its troops, panic ensues. They couldn't rally the army. They retreat all the way back to Washington, D.C. The thing is, one reason why they couldn't do that is because why the Confederacy couldn't take Washington is because they were just as confused and panicked as the Union. This was the largest battle fought on North American soil up to this point. The Confederacy suffered 1,982 casualties, while the Union suffered 2,896 casualties. Does anyone know the difference between casualty and death when it comes to warfare? Anyone know? So casualties is people that are injured. So people removed from battle, they're injured. Deaths is you're dead. So there were a lot of casualties on both sides, but the Union suffered more casualties. Yes, AJ, hurt versus being dead. So with the defeat at Bull Run, the Union and the North sees that blind enthusiasm for war is not enough to win it. So many feel this new purpose in the war effort. But this also gives yes, Justin, casualties do include injuries. This gives the South renewed vigor that, oh, we can do this. We can beat the Union. So what we're going to call the Western theater of the Civil War was, you're talking about like Mississippi, Alabama. So the war is going along. You have the Battle of Fort Henry along the Tennessee River and the Fort Donelson along the Cumberland River, two forts that were built to protect Tennessee in the deep South from invasion. But this is where you have General Grant come along and basically take these two forts. So basically getting Tennessee out of the war very quickly. Tennessee doesn't last very long in the war. They basically spent a lot of the war occupied. This is also where Grant gets his nickname on U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Basically says you just surrender. There's no conditions, just surrender. That's where he gets his name from. That was in February 1862. In March of 1862, we have the Battle of the Monitor and the Virginia. A lot of people know it as the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, but it's actually the Virginia because the Merrimack was a Union ship. And when they captured Hampton Roads, Virginia, they captured that ironclad and changed its name to the Virginia. Does anyone know why this battle is the Battle of Hampton Roads between the Monitor and Virginia is such a big battle that we're gonna talk about? I mean, it's just two boats fighting each other. Why is it so important? Go ahead and let me know. Okay, Justin, you don't know, that's fine. Anyone else know why this battle is important? AJ doesn't know. Raul, are you with us? Do you know? So the battle between the Monitor and the Virginia was a battle between two ships that they were called ironclads. These are armored ships with steel. Up to that point, battles were fought with ships made of wood. These ships were made of wood, but they were also armor plated. So basically, the Battle of Hampton Roads was two ironclad ships shooting cannons at each other, and basically the cannonballs bouncing off each side. This was the first battle between two ships that were armored. It ended in a draw. And actually, I think it was the day after or 2 days after, the Monitor sank because it got caught in a storm because it wasn't built to sail the ocean. So it went too far out into this ocean and it sank. They just recently found it. But this is the first time that two ironclads fight. This is going to be basically the future of warfare, naval warfare, is that you're going to build ships out of steel and metal, not wood anymore. It's going to take a while, but this is where naval warfare is headed. So that was March 1862. In April 6th and 7th of 1862, in the Western Theater at the Battle of Shiloh, the Confederacy surprises Grant's army. It turns out that this is probably one of the deadliest battles of the Civil War. More men died at this battle than all of the American wars combined at that time. The Union lost 13,000 men. The Confederacy lost 10,000 men. So the Union loses 3,000 men more than the Confederacy. So a lot of people in Washington are pleading with Lincoln to get rid of Grant. He's obviously not a good general. We just lost 13,000 men. The thing is, up to this point, throughout a lot of battles in the Eastern Theater, is that a lot of the generals of the Grand Republic, the Grand Army of the Republic, not the Star Wars, but that's what the United States called theirs, the Grand Army of the Republic, were not very good generals. At this time, you went to West Point, you were appointed to West Point, but you were not really, a lot of these generals weren't soldiers, they were appointed. by people. They had people that knew them and had power behind them. And it's like, oh, well, make him a general because I know him. He knows a senator, we'll make him a general. Grant came up through the ranks. I mean, Grant, dropped out of the army after the Mexican War and tried, different ways to make money, but then he found out he was good at being a soldier. So at the Battle of Shiloh, he loses all these troops. People in Washington are calling for his head. The problem is all these generals that are fighting in the Eastern Theater aren't doing well, but Grant is fighting. He doesn't run away from a fight. And we'll talk about that here a little bit. Like General McClellan, he runs from fights. So Lincoln basically said to all these people calling for Grant's head, he goes, I'm not going to fire him. I can't spare this man because he fights. So at the Battle of Seven Pines, basically the general of the Army of Virginia, who is General Johnston, is seriously injured at the Battle of the Seven Pines. So the Confederacy turns to Robert E. Lee to command the Army of Virginia. When the war started, Lee was originally offered to command all Union forces by Lincoln, but he resigned because he said, and quote, I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, and my children. So General Lee takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June of 1862. Now this is, once again, talking about General McClellan. General McClellan was unimpressed with this, speaking that Lee was likely to be timid and irresolute in action. Well, I'm going to say McClellan found out that was way wrong. So this is another advantage that the South has. The South basically gets all of the great generals. Stonewall Jackson, Johnston, P.T.G. Beauregard, Robert E. Lee. So basically, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia would defeat Union generals left and right. McClellan was always too careful, always believing that he didn't have enough troops to fight, so he'd always wait and request more. Many times McClellan actually had Lee on the ropes, but he didn't do it. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't end it. Like at the 7 Days Battle in 1862, McClellan was within 15 miles of the Confederate capital of Richmond, and he just stopped. He withdrew, and that allowed the Confederacy and the army to get away and also regroup and fight another day. So there's a second Battle of Bull Run. Second Battle of Bull Run is in August of 1862. You have Stonewall Jackson and General Longstreet against General Pope of the Union. 13,000 casualties for the Union compared to 8,300 for the Confederacy. They retreated back to Washington. After that battle, Pope is relieved of command by Lincoln. So the Battle of Antietam, Lee and the Confederacy have basically momentum on their side. So the Confederacy decides to invade the North at the Battle of Antietam. The Confederacy invades the North with 50,000 troops. McClellan has an army of 90,000 to stop them. They meet at Antietam, Maryland. And by the end of the day, 23,000 men are dead, missing, or wounded. Lee and his army retreat to Virginia. By November of 1862, Lincoln is tired of McClellan and him. I need more troops or I can't win. So he fires McClellan and hires Ambrose Burnsides to be the new general. Burnside replaces McClellan as the commander of the Army of the Potomac in November of 1862, and he is determined to launch a new attack on the Confederate Army. With forces of over 122,000 men, he attacks Robert E. Lee's army of 78,500 men at Fredericksburg. The Confederate Army is already dug in, so the Union loses 12,700 men killed or wounded, while the dug-in Confederacy only loses 5,300 men. Burnside wanted to press the attack, but he was turned away by his other generals. So the war is not going well for the Union. It's 1862. It's not going well. I mean, people are like, we should be beating the South. Why are we fighting this war? Who cares about the South? Just let them go. Who cares? So Lincoln needs something to keep the war effort going. The way he does this is that he writes 2 executive orders. So on January 1st, 1863, well, the first executive order is issued in September of 1862 to declare that all slaves in any state of the Confederacy. Let me start over, sorry. First one is issued in September of 1862, declaring freedom for all slaves in any state of the Confederate States of America that did not return to Union control by January 1st of 1863. The second order was issued in January 1st of 1863, and it named specific states. Okay, so tell me what's wrong with this picture. President Lincoln emancipates, basically frees the slaves in the Confederacy. What's wrong with that picture? Go, let me know. Anybody know? President Lincoln declares that the slaves, he's freeing the slaves in the Confederacy. No, those were still there. That's right, Justin. What else? Anybody else? No? Exactly, AJ. He has no authority to do so. The Confederacy considered themselves a separate nation. They were a separate nation. Lincoln had no power in the South. So when he issued this, that was one of the things that people attacked him for. The Emancipation Proclamation at the time was only freeing slaves in states that the Union had no power in. The proclamation, like Justin said, did not free any slaves in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, or Delaware, or West Virginia. It also didn't free any of the slaves in the southern states that were already under Union control, like Tennessee. It first only directed those slaves who had already escaped to the Union. Hearing the proclamation, more slaves quickly escaped to the Union lines and as the Union moved south. So basically, he was giving the reason for this war. Most people didn't want to fight this war anymore. It was stupid. People were dying. Why do we care? Now, Lincoln changed it to this is a war of freeing the slaves. There's a cause now that people can get behind. So in the West, in January of 1863, Grant lays siege to the Confederate city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was basically sits on the Mississippi. If you capture Vicksburg, you capture basically how the South could get stuff over to the their western territories like Arkansas and Texas. You capture Vicksburg, you cut off that part of the Confederacy. So Lee decides he's reconstituted his army, and in June of 1863, he leads an army of 75,000 and starts planning another invasion of the North. Lee's plan is to go through the Shenandoah Valley. He wanted to get up into Pennsylvania, reach Vicksburg, or reach Harrisburg, or even Philadelphia, in hopes that that would force the Union to end the war. So this is the plan. You know, he knows it's grinding on, and the South can't make it much longer. So he plans this invasion of the North. So this is the Battle of Gettysburg. It takes place on July 1st through July 3rd, 1863. In 3 days of fighting, 23,049 Union soldiers and 28,063 Confederate soldiers are killed. So adding that together, so 23,049 plus 28,063, that is 51,112 people killed in 3 days of fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg. The Vietnam War lasted for the United States from 1964 to 1973. That entire time frame, 58,209 were killed. So that is how bad the battle was. We also have to remember these are Americans fighting Americans, the Civil War. So looking at the battle, the Union and Confederate armies meet at the battle in Gettysburg by chance. There was a small detachment of Union troops that saw them coming, got a message to who is now in charge of the Union, General Meade, who got his troops up there as quickly as he could. So on day one, the ridges northwest of the town are defended by the Union cavalry, and they get reinforced. But the size of the Confederacy basically breaks those lines. By day two, that's when both armies get together, or both armies arrive and begin to fight. The Union lays out defensive lines. Lee launches attacks on the left flank. Despite heavy losses, the Union holds. On day three, the fighting continues. This is where you get Pickett's charge. General Pickett and 12,500 troops basically come up with this idea where they were going to break the lines of the Union. They advance across a quarter-mile field, open field, flat, all in a nice line, marching towards the Union line. It's a quarter mile to get from their position to Cemetery Ridge. It's known as Pickett's Charge. So basically, they are being hit by gunfire and shells, and they basically get wiped out. But what's funny is there was enough of them that they almost broke that line. They survived that march, almost broke the line, but the Union had enough people to back them up and repulse the attack. Basically, this was the last-ditch effort of the Confederacy. There would be no more offensive battles. Basically, there would be no more invasions. It would be a defensive war from now on for the Confederacy. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg falls. So Vicksburg falls after Grant laid siege to it for 6 weeks. That was the last major Confederate position on the Mississippi. The Union controls the Mississippi, cuts the Confederacy in half. Once he takes over, once Grant wins at Vicksburg, this is where Lincoln gives him command of basically all the forces of the Army, what is known as the Grand Army of the Republic, also the Army of the Potomac. One of his friends from West Point is William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman basically, or Grant and Sherman come up with the idea of wearing down the South. So on March 1864, Grant is given command of all the armies of the United States. Sherman is succeeded as commander of the Western forces. Grant advances towards Richmond to engage the Army of Northern Virginia. It's during these battles, it's called the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Huge losses are suffered. At the Wilderness, Grant loses 17,500 men in 2 days. On the evening of May 7th, he went into his tent and wept over these losses. Another interesting thing about Grant is he hated the sight of blood. His father was a tanner. He worked in basically, a tanner is someone who makes leather, so you got to get the leather off the bodies of the cows, so there's a lot of blood, and he hated blood. So one of the bloodiest generals in American history hated the sight of blood. So like we said, May 7th, he goes into his tent and cries over the losses of his men. Where other generals would have given up, Grant continues. At Spotsylvania, the Union loses 18,000 in casualties compared to 9,000 to 10,000 for Lee. By the end of this campaign, battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, the Army of the Potomac has lost 50,000 men. So this is the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Sherman marches to the sea with 100,000 men towards Atlanta. This is his march to the sea. He's taking on Johnston, 60,000 men of the Army of Tennessee. Atlanta falls in September 2nd of 1864. Atlanta falls. The Union Navy captures Mobile, Alabama. This helps get Lincoln reelected. The guy running against him, George McClellan. Sherman destroys Atlanta's railroad facilities and burns parts of the city. Basically, if anyone has seen Gone with the Wind, one of the big scenes is the burning of Atlanta. So that's one of his things. They called them Sherman bow ties, where they would take the rails, heat them up, and then, I don't know how they did it, but tie them together so they couldn't be used again. This is total warfare. So as he goes to Savannah, he burns everything along it so that nobody can use it. So by December, the Union forces have destroyed the second biggest Confederate force in the South. So the Army of Tennessee falls. So these are last-ditch efforts for the Confederacy, trying to basically save their country. So while this was happening, The Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens travels to Hampton Roads, Virginia for peace talks with Lincoln. This is called the Hampton Roads Conference, where they were trying to negotiate the end of the Civil War. It didn't work. At first, Lincoln didn't want to have anything to do with this conference, but Stephens basically said that that it would be agreed upon that the Southern states would abandon their attempt to secede, but it didn't work. Another tact they took was, well, you know, the French are in Mexico, because at this time the French had taken over Mexico, so we should get together and gang up on Mexico and push out the French. And then using Monroe Doctrine, because it was a European power within our sphere of influence, and then we could take over Mexico and divide it up. Basically, Lincoln was like, those are not really good ideas. Lincoln basically said this is the position of the Union. He disapproved of a joint attack of the French on Mexico. He wished for the voluntary abolition of slaves by the states. He refused to consent to any treaty with the Confederate government. After their surrender, he was in favor of readmitting representatives of the Southern states to Congress. He favored payment by the federal government of a fair indemnity to slaveholders, basically paying for the slaves to free them. Also, he would not weaken the Emancipation Proclamation, and he wanted a complete restoration of the Union. If that didn't happen, the war would continue. Like we said, the Confederacy didn't agree to it, and the war continued. Richmond, Virginia, and Petersburg, Virginia fall in June of 1864. A 9-month siege begins in June of 1864. Richmond falls in April of 1865, or in March of 1865. So Lee makes his way out of Virginia into North Carolina, and his plan was to hook up with General Joe Johnston in the Blue Ridge Mountains and hide from the Union forces. Now, if you've ever been to this part of the country, lots of trees, not really high. Oh, okay, AJ. I'll post it for you, and then you can watch it later. Sorry, you got to go. So back to this. So he could have fought a guerrilla war. This is something that right now the United States is still sort of dealing with in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that the war could drag on forever. So the Union at this time had captured Vicksburg, New Orleans, Nashville, Chattanooga, Atlanta, Savannah. These are all cities, very easy to control. You can put people in there and control the city. The problem is the Union did not control the lands all around the city. In 1865, when the Confederate capital fell, the Confederate army was on the run. Jefferson Davis basically called on a guerrilla war to be fought. Could it have worked? There were still huge armies of the Confederacy on the battlefield, still led by some of the greatest generals in American history. Guerrilla tactics had been used by both Union and Confederate forces in Missouri. So basically, you could do hit and runs on the cities. You would pull the Union forces out, and you could destroy them when they come out. This could have gone on for years. Now, Lee was a student of history, and one of the things that he really looked at was how Napoleon's armies during the Napoleonic Wars invaded Spain to take it over for France, and the Spanish basically rose up against him and fought a guerrilla war. That's where the word guerrilla comes from, not the great ape, but guerrilla, Guerrilla, guerrilla. Partisan fighting tore that nation apart, and that is not what Lee wanted to be his legacy for himself or the Confederacy. So I'm going to throw this out there. I want you guys to think about it. And as I continue to wrap up the Civil War, I want you to chime in when you get what you think about it. But the question is, if you were General Lee, what would have you done? Would have you continued to fight a guerrilla war against the Union, or would you have surrendered? So I'm going to leave that out there, and I'm going to wrap up the fighting for the Civil War here. So Lee is getting chased. I mean, he's trying to get away, but the Union Army is meeting him every time. They chase him all the way to Appomattox Courthouse. So on April 9th, 1865, after 4 years of fighting and the deaths of 630,000 men and over 1 million casualties, General Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant at the home of Wilmer McLean in the town of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. What is very interesting about Mr. Wilmer McLean is that the war started at his house and ended at his house. Wilmer McLean lived in Manassas, Virginia, home of the first battle of the Civil War. He tried to get away from it and moved to Appomattox Courthouse, where the war ended. So when they come together to end, and this didn't end the war, this was just a surrender of one army. Like we said, there were still Confederate armies in the field that could have continued to fight. So usually up to this point, I would have surrendered. Okay, good. Thank you, Justin. So what would have happened to these generals? Usually when a general surrenders, bad things happens. When Vercingetorix of the Gauls surrendered to Julius Caesar, he was taken to Rome as a war prize and executed. Napoleon was not exiled once, but twice. Grant didn't do that to Lee. Earlier in the year aboard the River Queen, where Grant, Lincoln, and Sherman met, they decided what should be done with the defeated Confederacy and their leadership. It was called the River Queen Doctrine, and Lincoln would offer the Confederacy generous terms, So, quote, to delude men of the rebel armies, disarm back to their homes. Let them surrender and reach their homes, and they will not take up arms again. Let them all go, officers and all. I want submission, no more bloodshed. I don't want anyone punished. I want to treat them liberally all around. We want those people to return their allegiance to the Union and submit to the laws. There must be no hangings. There must be no bloody work. There must be none of that. Grant allowed the Confederates to keep their sidearms and their horses. Do you think he would have done that if he was afraid of going to a guerrilla warfare? So basically, when Lee was riding out of Appomattox Courthouse All of the Union soldiers doffed their hats and saluted Lee. Another surrender took place on April 12th when Confederate General Gordon surrendered to Union General Chamberlain. The Confederates were to surrender their weapons and their battle standards, and they did this crying. As they did this, Chamberlain called out to his troops to salute the Confederates. Gordon acknowledged the gesture by bowing his horse to Chamberlain. Of course, over the next couple of months, Confederates would surrender to the Union, and they would have the same honor afforded to them. So, the cost of the Civil War. Raul and Justin, thank you for those answers. The cost of the Civil War were 25% of Southern white men of military age were killed. 25% of all Southerners who fought were injured. 20% of Mississippi's revenue in 1866 was earmarked for the purchase of artificial limbs. At the Battle of Gettysburg alone, there were 51,000 Confederate and Union casualties. More than 25% of Union soldiers were killed or wounded. 40,000 black soldiers died. 30,000 from wounds and disease. 80 Confederate generals and 80 Union generals were killed. 2 regiments, the 1st Texas at Antietam and the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg, lost 82% of their men in a single battle. 500,000 farms and plantations in the South were destroyed or ruined during the war. By the end of the war, more than 60% of the Southern-based railroad companies were bankrupt, and most of the rail lines were unfit for use. In Columbia, South Carolina, 1,386 buildings were destroyed or burned. 66% of all the assessed wealth of the South was lost. The combined cost of the war for both the Union and the Confederacy was $81 billion. So you can see how that war really changed everything about who we are as Americans. So it is now 7:02, and we have one last little bit to get through tonight, and then you will be free to go. And I'm going to throw this out there to make sure that you've all gone over the syllabus and you have the book. This is basically the lectures are basically to help give you a little bit more background that you may not find in the book. So it is 7:03. Let's take a 5-minute break. So at 7:08, we'll come back and we'll get into Reconstruction. Is that good with you guys? Let me know. Chime in. Okay, good. Like I said, on the syllabus, there's reading in there, so that'll be good for you, Justin. So, okay, so like I said, 7:03, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back and talk about Reconstruction, okay? I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes.
Original.
Okay. Oops. All right, you guys back? Let me know. And roll. Okay. So we're all back. We're going to go ahead and finish up this session with Reconstruction. So as early as 1863, Lincoln was already planning for the Reconstruction of the United States. His plan was pretty simple. 10% of the eligible voting population would have to take the oath of allegiance. Once that was done, it'd be smooth sailing for the Confederate states to rewrite a new state constitution, have a new state government, and elect members of Congress. This was already in place in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana because they were some of the first states to fall to the Union during the Civil War. So a lot of states had already met Lincoln's criteria to become a state again, but Congress blocked them, didn't want to remit them. Congress didn't like the way Lincoln was making decisions without consulting Congress. So this was the executive trying to hold power over the legislative. So at the beginning of the war, Congress didn't have any problems with Lincoln expanding his powers and expanding the powers of the president. Now that the war looks like it was going to be over, Congress wanted to pull some of those powers back and come up with their own plan for Reconstruction. And some of these challenges to Lincoln's plan came from the Republican Party. One of the groups that had a problem with this was called the Radical Republicans. Now, the Radical Republicans were a very small but loud faction of the Republican Party. They were abolitionists. Abolitionists were people that before the war that wanted to abolish slavery altogether. The abolitionists also blamed all of these Southern planters for the war and wanted to punish them along with the rest of the South. Punishing the South was their main goal. Since they couldn't hang the leaders of the South, they wanted to cut their power off. They wanted to make sure that the new South was going to be different from the old and insisted that free slaves or freedmen would participate in Southern government. So the Radical Republicans passed in July of 1864 the Wade-Davis Bill. Congress, not the president, would decide which state would reapply for readmission, and they had to jump through hoops to get to that point. Instead of 10%, as Lincoln said, Congress wanted 50% of the eligible voters to take the oath of allegiance. Beyond that, the Radical Republicans really didn't have a plan on Reconstruction. Lincoln quickly killed that bill with a veto, or as we call it, or what's called a pocket veto. A pocket veto doesn't require that the president explain the reasoning of vetoing the bill. After Lincoln's reelection in 1864, he began to reach out to the Radical Republicans. He didn't really like them, but he had no objections to granting the right to vote to blacks, as long as they were very intelligent. Those blacks who had fought for the Union. So there was another roadblock. Why didn't Lincoln want to side with the Radical Republicans? The whole point of the war for Lincoln was to restore the Union and have reconciliation between the states that were in the South and the Union states. When the war was starting to lose its popularity in the North, Lincoln used the emancipation of the slaves as a rallying cry to get the North interested in the war again. It was no longer about saving the Union. It was about freeing enslaved people. Lincoln repeated the fact that the North and the South had to become one again in the inaugural speech. Now, when you go to one of the tasks on your in the syllabus, you'll be addressing this. So in his second inaugural speech on March 4th, 1865, Lincoln said, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us all strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves." Freeing the slaves was a secondary idea or a secondary goal for Lincoln. What he thought is, what if white Southerners insisted that they would not accept blacks as equals? Lincoln was fine with that. In fact, he dodged any statements that he could be accountable for in the future. A perfect politician. I'm just not going to talk about it. So in 1864, when he was running for re-election, Lincoln chose a new running mate for his second term for his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in Tennessee. He was born poor. He didn't learn how to read until he was an adult. He was the only Southern senator not to walk out of Congress in 1861. Johnson wanted a war that was going to punish the South for secession. After Tennessee was captured, Lincoln appointed Johnson governor of occupied Tennessee. It was where his work there and Lincoln's quest to win over the Southern Unionists why he selected Johnson as a running mate. As he was the governor of Tennessee, occupied Tennessee during the war, Johnson approved the seizing of rebel states and called for the punishment of all Confederate leaders. So, I didn't know the main goal. I didn't know that I was taught the main goal was. That's not the way, Rebel, that's not the way the war originally was. It was originally fought over states' rights. Like we said, Lincoln, the North was losing interest, so he had to find some way to get people interested again. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln's reelected. March 4th, malice towards none, charity towards all. We're going to reestablish the Union. No punishment. So the war is over. Lee just surrendered. Things are looking good. So Lincoln's like, okay, it's finally over. I can relax. Decides to go take in a show at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. My American Cousin. Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. This is only one of the assassinations that was supposed to take place that night. There was a cabal that John Wilkes Booth created. One assassin went to the home of Secretary of State Seward and stabbed him 5 times. Johnson was supposed to be assassinated, but at the last minute, the assassin got cold feet. Lincoln dies. Johnson succeeds Lincoln as President of the United States. The radical Republicans loved Andrew Johnson because he was one of them. He wanted to punish the South. They figured they could work with him. Well, Johnson pulled a 180 on him, and instead of being the radical Republican and saying, we're going to punish the South, he went with the Reconstruction plan that Lincoln did of 1863. Johnson did not consult Congress before announcing his plan. Andrew Johnson was a student of the Constitution. Johnson believed that the Constitution was permanent. The Union could not be dissolved and states could not secede. So So the group that was called the Confederate States of America had rebelled and fought a war, but Johnson saw it as individuals that had rebelled. The states didn't secede because they couldn't. They were still states. They were still parts of the Union. Seating congressional representatives was an administrative matter, which made it the president's job. So under the rules, or under Johnson's rules, white voters quickly drew up new state constitutions and elected congressmen and senators, many of which were former Confederate leaders. Johnson angered Northerners, but this was Lincoln's plan, not to punish, but pardon those who had rebelled. Johnson took to pardoning former Confederates to a new level. By the end of 1865, He had pardoned 13,000 former Confederates, restoring their civil rights. So freedom came to the slaves in two different ways. There were some that couldn't believe that they were free. Some of them were very well treated by their former masters and stayed on with them because they offered them money once they, so instead of being a slave, it was like, well, I still need you to work for me, so I'll pay you to work for me. So they continued to work the field like they always had. Others that had escaped the South headed to the North and heard the rumors about 40 acres and a mule. This was a rumor going around that if once you're free, the Union was going to give you 40 acres of land and a mule to create your new life as a freeman. And they would search for Union officers and say, well, give it to me. I need it. Some other former slaves didn't know what to do. They were free. They had never been free before, so they just wandered around. They had no idea what to do. So the problem with Johnson pardoning former Confederate leaders is that they're still linked to this old South, the old antebellum South, the old slave South. So pre-war standards on blacks were in full effect after the war was over. These new Southern governments, approved by Johnson, established what's called the Black Codes, which was basically reestablishing slavery without actually calling it slavery. The ability of the freedmen to move around angered many of the Southern plantation owners. There's a bunch of, former slaves wandering around out of control, according to these Southern landowners. So they wanted to make sure that these blacks stayed in place. And their place was they were inferior to the whites. So the Black Codes made it illegal for blacks to live in towns and cities. Blacks couldn't bear arms. In South Carolina, they couldn't sell anything. In Mississippi, they were required to sign one-year labor contracts. If they didn't, they would be arrested and their labor for a year would be sold to the highest bidder. But they were free. Or were they? So here's the question. Why couldn't Johnson and Congress work together?
He was in Wilson when he was a little kid, and he moved back to, I guess, living.
So some of the Black Codes, I'm just going to read some off to you. This was the Louisiana Black Code of 1865. Here's some of them. No Negro shall be allowed to pass within the limit of said parish with special permission in writing from his employer. No Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house in said parish. Every Negro is required to be the regular service of some white person or former owner who shall be responsible for the conduct of said Negro. If a Negro is found drunk within said parish, they shall pay a fine of $5 or in default thereof work for 5 days on a public road. $5 in 1865 was a lot of money. There was a lack. This was Justin. There was a lack of trust between Congress and Johnson. Johnson was still following in his president's footsteps of keeping basically the power with the president. So all of these problems that are going on with the blacks, with the freed slaves wandering around, not having really anything that they could do or didn't have a direction. Congress saw that these freedmen could become a problem if they weren't given help in a direction. In March of 1865, Congress establishes the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands that would be run by the Army. The Army put General O.O. Howard in front of it, and O.O. Howard's first task was to prevent mass starvation in the South. We talked earlier about how badly devastated the South was. I mean, farms destroyed. You can't grow food, people are going to starve. In 1865, the Bureau fed 150,000 people, including whites. The Bureau built 46 hospitals that treated illness and injuries. They built schools to educate the freedmen. Bureau was only supposed to be a stopgap measure until the new Southern governments were up and running. But the problem is, by February of 1866, Reconstruction was at a standstill. Congress was refusing to recognize Johnson's state governments, and the Congress hadn't readmitted any states. So the Bureau continued on for another 2 years. So the radical Republicans knew Johnson's plan and how it was playing in the North, and many in the North hated the new black codes. Yet the North wasn't sure about granting the rights to slaves was the right thing to do. I mean, a lot of these slaves, you couldn't get an education. They get an education, they may rise up against their owners. So that was one thing that they were never given. So 16 of the 23 Union states didn't allow blacks to vote. Reconstruction was in full swing. The radical Republicans wanted Congress to have a say in it. So many in Congress wanted to punish the South for secession. Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania saw the South as conquered territory and it needed to be treated that way. Congress's Joint Committee on Reconstruction came up with a formula of their own. This is radical Reconstruction. The South had the right to refuse to seat Southerners as elected representatives from rebel states. So Johnson vetoed the bill that granted citizenship to the freedmen. Johnson said that the Constitution gave the state the power to decide terms of citizenship. But along with stories of what was happening in the South, black codes, the radical Republicans, now joined by moderates of the party, created constitutional amendments on which to base Congress's Reconstruction policy on and to answer Johnson's points of citizenship. The 14th Amendment banned all high-ranking Confederates from federal and state offices unless they were pardoned by Congress. The amendment established national citizenship, guaranteed that all citizens of the United States would be treated equally under the laws of that state. It would prevent Southern state governments from passing laws like the Black Codes. The 14th Amendment would also cancel Northern state laws that discriminated against blacks. The run for the White House in 1868 would continue to decide the path of Reconstruction. So radical Reconstruction takes place from 1867 to 1877. Remember, the radicals want to punish the South. So the South is divided into 5 military provinces commanded by a major general. The army would maintain order. Voters, black and white, would elect members to a constitutional convention where they would have to ratify the 13th and the 14th Amendments. It was also during this time that President Johnson came up on impeachment charges. So another question I'm going to throw out there to you is, did President Johnson deserve to be impeached?
He was standing between our front door and this idiot guy's car and told her
he missed by being impeached by one vote, or removed from office by one vote. He was impeached, but he missed being removed from office by one vote. But there was no way he was going to get reelected. And usually, so in the election of 1868, we wanted somebody new. So we went to what we always do, or what Americans like to do, and that's voting for a war hero. So this is President Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was elected in 1868.
To help that situation, I pointed out, like, yeah.
Okay, Raul, why did, excuse me, Raul, why did Johnson deserve to be impeached? Justin says no. Raul says yes. Why did he deserve to be impeached?
My perspective is, yeah. Oh my God. It's pretty messed up. I'm not sure what or if anybody can or will do anything.
Well, at this point. But you can talk to her about stuff like that.
Oh, I wish she could, you know, if she's going to want something from me, inevitably she comes. When she, you know, mom and dad have no more money and the kids have nowhere else to turn, she'll come to me. And she knows that if she wants to eventually.
The guy's typing away.
For the girls at all, she has to listen to what we say.
So she just has to listen, she doesn't have to do anything.
Well, no, I don't ever do anything for her. I'm done doing anything for her.
So I'm going to continue. You guys give me the reason why you think that he should have had more control. He should have had more control. So a powerful executive. A dictator, Raul?
Next time she comes to us, try to bail out something for Rena, we get her.
So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up for you guys for tonight. So Grant is elected president in 1868 and in 1872. He retires greenbacks. Greenbacks are the paper money that was used during the war because we didn't have enough gold, so we issued greenbacks. His presidency is full of corruption and scandal. Black Friday, Credit Mobiler, the Whiskey Ring, and others. He is challenged by the liberal Republicans in 1872 and wins again. Once he's reelected, there is economic panic and depression in his second term. Also, some things I want you to look into for this is carpetbaggers. That's another thing about Reconstruction that we're going to look into. Carpetbaggers.
She's old enough now, you can have a conversation with her and say, I know this is going to happen.
So basically, Reconstruction ends in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Basically, he just says, we're done. We're just going to let them all in. So I'm going to leave you with this question. And did Reconstruction work?
There's been a couple of times this year that she's tried to make arrangements to just come over here and stay with us.
So that's it for tonight. Make sure that you go to the syllabus online to see what you need to do. So taking a look at all the stuff you need to do, all this needs to be in and done. So reading section 1 online discussion. Let me see if I can get it pulled up here for you.
Your face and your other face at 4 o'clock in the morning. You might find it off.
Okay. Let's see if it pops up here. It's not what I wanted. Okay, hold on a second. I want that. Okay. Oop. This. Okay, so looking at discussion, click on your discussion link. After posting your initial response, please comment on classmates' responses. Please respond by making constructive responses or raising questions that will promote further discussion. Best practice is to post early and continue to participate throughout this session. You will not only be graded by your posting, but your participation. The initial post is due by Wednesday at 11:59. Also, a minimum of 2 additional responses to these posts are due at 11:59 on Sunday. These are the minimum requirements. Be sure to follow any additional guidelines posted by myself regarding discussions. So you can see here's what the discussions are, the questions. So those are the ones we want to answer. So also make sure you read all of this stuff for me. Okay. So basically that's where we are going to end it for tonight. No, Justin, that is correct. Reconstruction didn't settle much. And Raul, yes, thank you for chiming in and getting on board. I really enjoy having you guys here. So go ahead and get those assignments done for the first session and get your reading done, all that. And then next Monday we will do it again. I will send you the links. Also, I will send you guys the link to what we did here tonight, so you can get caught up on that. And also, I'm probably going to do screencasts of the PowerPoint discussion, so you can, or the PowerPoint, so you can see it and you can take notes off of that. Okay. So thank you very much for joining me tonight, and I will see you next Monday. So have a great week. I look forward to seeing your stuff on the discussion board. Have a great week. Thank you, guys.